Hi and welcome. I'm Sarah, brand strategist and designer, and I'm so excited to sit down with Kayla Hollatz, a seasoned copywriter whose words have the power to transform ideas into captivating brand narratives. I had the honor of working with Kayla on my own website copy, and today we'll explore how copy fits into a successful rebranding process and how impactful copy can set you apart. Thank you so much for joining me, Kayla. I'm so excited to have you here. How about you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And that was such a kind introduction and it was so intentional. So thank you very much. But much like you said, in much better words than probably what I will even say, is that I'm a website copywriter who loves to work with entrepreneurs and different tech and SaaS companies on their copywriting. And so I'm really excited to be here today to talk a little bit more about the really intrinsic relationship between design and copy, but then also where copy has a very important role to play in the overall website process as well as branding as a whole.
Awesome. And what do you find are some of the most common misconceptions that you encounter among your clients regarding the role of website copy in particular?
Sure. I think that's such a good question because there are a lot of them. And I've been a copywriter for 8 years. And so I think something that's kind of fun for me is that I've been able to get a kind of front row seat to kind of see how the industry has changed over almost a decade. And I would say, one of the misconceptions that has continued to come up time and time again is that copy kind of tends to be a little bit of an afterthought for people. I am very happy to say that there's a lot more people now who even know what a copywriter is. I remember going to networking events and hearing people say like, "Oh, you do copyright law." And you go, "Nope, I'm not as cool as that." Like I definitely just I do some website copywriting, but it is really fascinating to see just like how often it is that people don't necessarily understand that a lot of times designers and copywriters agree that copywriting ought to come first when you are kind of planning out the overall flow of how a website comes together. But it often is that you engage a copywriter last minute or you pull one in because maybe as a designer, you're working with a client and starting to realize very quickly that it's hard for them to deliver the copy that they thought that they were going to be able to work on. So I say that's one of the most common misconceptions that there is right now.
Yeah, that's definitely my experience too from a brand designer and web designer's perspective. Website copy tends to be that afterthought, and it's not as part of the process as I would like it to be as a designer, because the better the copy, the easier it is for me to design a website around it. But yeah, maybe you can sum up some of the primary benefits that businesses can expect when they do invest in professional copywriting.
Absolutely. Well, one of the first things is that most businesses that I work with, when I ask them, have you ever gone through any sort of exploration of brand voice? Have you put together a mission statement? Some of these things that as copywriters, we would tend to consider your most essential elements of your messaging. Many people feel like those are the things that they actually feel the least confident in. And so that's why copywriting goes so much farther beyond just your website itself, but it also is creating some of those foundational building blocks for your overall brand messaging. Because most of the time, once we get a great mission statement on a website, you're able to use that in so many different ways in your marketing and in your social media and brochures and all sorts of other types of marketing materials. And so I think that's one of the huge values of investing in website copywriting is you are able to repurpose it in other areas, especially if you're working with a website copywriter that considers themselves more of a strategist and you're going even through a deeper brand voice process. I know every copywriter is a little bit different about how they exactly approach that. But another way that it can be really beneficial to work with a website copywriter, especially one like myself, is that we are able to give a little bit more of an idea of what is the content perspective when it comes to strategy. Because again, content comes together usually before the design comes together. And so sometimes we can kind of have that argument of the chicken and the egg. Like, does the design come together, the copywriting? Who owns the strategy? Is it the copywriter or the designer? But I think one really great way of working with a website copywriter is that not only do you come away with the messaging, but you also come away with the reasoning as to why things are going to be structured in a certain way, why you're going to be creating a website. It's so much beyond just getting the right photos and the right content. It's how you pair all of the different elements with your branding, with all of the wonderful things that you work with clients on to create a fuller picture of a website that really connects and communicates the value that you bring to your clients or your customers.
Yeah, I can definitely agree to that from a client perspective. Having worked with you, it's now so much easier for me to craft my messaging for anything, not just a website,
Mhm.
but I can take bits and pieces from your words that you've created for me and use them elsewhere and just infuse them throughout. And also, like I said, from a designer's perspective, I just love having content first because then I can shape the design around the content and not afterwards have to kind of press the content into a mold that I've created. But I think that brings us to my next question. In your experience, what does an ideal website development process look like? And
Mhm.
when is the right time to bring in the copywriter?
Absolutely. Such a good question. So, I would say for the vast majority of copywriters and designers, the ideal development process usually looks like working with either a copywriter first, or in tandem, you really can work with a branding designer. A lot of times I say if a branding designer has a questionnaire, feel free to send that over to me too, because we have really similar processes and really trying to get at the heart of your brand messaging and also your brand visuals. They come together really well. But typically I'd say copywriting even before branding design, if at all possible, just because I know branding designers can also like to have the questionnaire and the copywriting from the copywriter. So copywriting and brand design, and then absolutely website design afterwards. And then website development, of course, is going to follow the website design. But I'd say what you often see is website design coming before copy. Copy is that last ditch effort that they're trying to pull together last minute. And then trying to develop things while also meeting that original launch time, not realizing that they needed to hire a copywriter earlier.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen that happen. Yeah. And also, what I find is that clients often underestimate how difficult it actually
Sure.
is to create copy and to write it themselves when they want to write it themselves. But yeah, what would you say, like specifically for the website strategy? Who should take the lead on that? The web designer or the copywriter?
Yeah, see, it's such a tricky question because I will just say for myself, I do enjoy taking it on myself. And I will say, I still have yet in my 8 years to have a website designer say, no, I want to take it on instead. Most of the time, website designers I work with go, please run with it. So then I don't necessarily have to do that part, you know? And I think that that's just because when you're coming together with the website designer, a lot of times they are bringing the beautiful visuals, they're bringing the presentation of how everything's going to look. But as a copywriter, we need to be thinking about how is all of the content going to be organized. And while there are some copywriters who still kind of write inside a Word doc or a Google Doc, and they'll just maybe sometimes put headers and paragraph copy and different things, what we find more often than not is that it ends up just being, you know, that the designer is getting this large document that doesn't really take into account where all this content is going to go. And then, of course, your job ends up becoming somehow a copy editor as well as a website designer because you're needing to. I love that you said like you almost feel like you have to press into it and kind of see, okay, like let's condense it, let's figure out what stays, what goes. When as a website strategist myself, I can actually go through having a conversation about all of those things before I even start writing anything, which I think is why it can be helpful for the website copywriter to really hone in their skills with website strategy, is because you can have that initial conversation. Everybody feels more confident, from the client to the copywriter to the designer. Everybody's on the same page. That's a horrible copywriter pun, but for real, everybody is on the same page so that when everybody can kind of like go and divide and conquer, then it just works really well. But there are, website designers, of course, that end up becoming website strategists. But I would say the website strategy comes even before the website copywriting does, ideally. So,
Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I can say from my experience as your client, from that unique position of being my own website designer,
Mhm.
it really made huge difference for me. Even though I do website strategy and I know how to divide the content and how to structure a website, it was a huge relief for me to have the copy already
Mm,
be strategic and to
mhm.
have you think about where does it go? How can we structure it in a way that makes sense visually? It made my job so much easier. And that was also the reason why it was so important for me to work with a copywriter
Mm.
because I had so many fragmented pieces and ideas and just kind of a visual direction, but it wasn't cohesive. But what the copy did was it really gave me a guide and it led in the end to a much stronger design and just a much stronger website, in my opinion, than it would have been if I just did everything myself.
I think even in the way that we collaborated too, as you're saying, it's really nice to feel like my opportunity as a website strategist is that I get to pitch you ideas. And I use that as an opportunity to also educate on the value of not just the content we're crafting, but also the way that we're crafting everything together. And I know I've been saying about having that strategic conversation up front, but it really does help with building that client trust so that when you have the handoff of, okay, I'm going to now independently work on the content, trust me that I'm going to be able to deliver something that you're going to be really happy with. Before you see any words, you already have the confidence of how these different pieces are going to be coming together. So I think, much to your point, it's really helpful to have um, yeah, just those strategic discussions. And then what was so wonderful, especially for you as a designer, is that you're able to have enough of that content direction so that when you have the visual direction that comes together with your skill set or a client who's going to be working with a designer, they're able to add in more of their energy into the visual direction, which is most of the time what they're most passionate about anyway, versus
Yes.
thinking about conversion strategy, thinking about SEO. All the other things that I geek out about that many designers feel like, nope, you can cover that.
Yes, absolutely. I can definitely confirm that. But have you ever encountered a situation where there were too many cooks in the kitchen and you had a situation where you had differing opinions with a web designer?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'm trying to think. I would say for the most part, I play really well and I play very nice with collaborators. So I haven't had too many instances of that, but I have had times where I feel like it would have been maybe more helpful to really define what each person's role is. And I think that's what's so important when you are what I would consider the term like assembling your team, because as a copywriter who's freelancing, a lot of times I'm working with different designers and different developers each time. So I have to understand that everybody's going to have a different process. And I don't necessarily want there to be overlap. I don't necessarily want to be like walking on someone's toes, all of those sorts of things. So I usually have a conversation up front with the collaborators, ask for the client to introduce all of us, to let them know, hey, this is my process. This is typically what my role is. If you feel like anything needs to change or shift based on your own process, please feel free to let me know. So again, it kind of brings up that theme that we keep talking about having conversations up front, but it really does help when you're kind of putting a few different people who operate separately, but also we operate together and it needs to be a cohesive product. And that's kind of the benefit of working with a website designer, a brand designer, sometimes a brand photographer, a website copywriter, and a website developer sometimes too. When you've got those people who are all working together and know what their role is, it can be a really seamless process.
Yes, I totally agree. And that's my experience as well. And also, from a client's perspective, I would say if you're the client, do not be afraid to bring all these people together and ask
Mhm.
them to collaborate because most of the times we're excited to and we're happy to because it means we get to focus on what we do best instead of taking on all those different
Yes.
roles that might not be to our strength. I'm always excited when my
Mhm.
clients have a copywriter because then I can trust that the copywriter knows what they're doing and I do not have to do the copy editing that I will usually do a little bit for my clients that DIY the copy. So for me, it's always exciting to work in collaboration with other
Yeah.
creatives, and I feel like for you, it's the same.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that the client gets a lot of confidence when everything is kind of being created somewhat in tandem because you're able to see how all of those different pieces. And when you have one discovery with, let's say, a brand designer, you can bring that discovery into the brand voice process, which then is translated into the website design and development. So everything just becomes just a really seamless product from start to finish. But I completely agree with you. It is so wonderful to work with other people. And most copywriters and designers and photographers, they are used to collaborating with others. And so I
Yes.
think that that's as a client, I would absolutely ask upfront when you're kind of interviewing slash having discovery calls with designers and copywriters, ask them, how do you normally collaborate with others? What does that look like? Because some people will have a little bit more of an ironed out, like this is the exact process that I follow and then I just deliver. And then there's others that'll be maybe a little bit more flexible about kind of what timelines look like and how to best collaborate with each individual. I'd say I'm kind of somewhere in between. I'm flexible enough, but I also have enough of a signature process that I want to be able to follow. So I kind of am somewhere on that spectrum.
Yeah, I feel like I'm also somewhere on that spectrum. I do have my process, but I'm also
Mhm.
happy to collaborate and tweak things to make it more collaborative. Ultimately, we do what we do to give the clients the best result possible. And if that means
Absolutely.
tweaking a little, I feel like we're all kind of happy too. I think that's definitely something that you, as our audience, can take away from this. Do ask for collaboration and don't be afraid to bring different people together and to assemble your dream team of people.
Mhm. Yes, and go with your gut on it too. If you feel like there's somebody that you would really, really like to work with, and maybe they give you some referrals, and maybe you find someone else on your own, assemble the team that you want. I think that there can be, of course, benefits to working with agencies and with people that maybe have already a whole flow of people that are kind of set. But I would say one of the benefits to assembling your team yourself instead is that you get to cherry pick exactly who's in the driver's seat of all of these different parts. And I think as long as you're asking the right questions during that discovery call and really getting a sense if this person is even beyond the work product itself that they're going to deliver, if it feels like that person is a good strategic partner for you, creative partner for you, then I think that that's just the confidence that you need in order to feel like you can assemble a team that maybe hasn't existed before, which is a really wonderful and, like you said, it's a new collaboration, but it's all about picking those right members.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, from a designer's perspective, I'm always excited to work with new people because that always brings new opportunities for us too. We get to meet someone new, get to work with someone new, and that always is an experience and always a beneficial one for, I think, everyone involved most of the time.
Absolutely. I would 100% agree.
So, in your experience, what are some of the most common challenges that businesses face when they're trying to communicate their brand effectively through copy?
Mm. I would say definitely brand voice always seems to come up. I think even more specifically with brand voice, feeling a lot of times like if you have multiple people who work with you and your brand and have written different things, sometimes you feel like your brand voice is just cobbled together content pieces from different voices of different people because of course we are all an individual. But I think one of the great things, if you are creating more of a like company forward brand versus a personal brand, is really making sure that the brand voice is cohesive, that there's kind of a brand personality that might have elements of each of your personalities individually, but that still create something cohesive so that if somebody is interacting with one of your customer service reps on social media, it's as consistent as somebody who's going to be reading something on your blog or your website. So that's something that if you go a little bit deeper into the brand voice process, which can be done kind of in tandem with the website copywriting process, and I always recommend for brand voice to come first. So usually that process within is the more meta process would be brand voice, website strategy, then website copywriting, just to kind of have
Yeah.
that in a nice little package. But it really kind of depends on the company in terms of what they are most challenged by. I'd say another thing, of course, too, is very common to hear about lead generation is difficult. So if I'm thinking about that, then I really want to think about SEO. If a lot of it isn't necessarily lead generation, but also just being able to convert into those sales calls and those things, then I'll also look at conversion strategy and see how that's going. So it really depends on the exact challenge that somebody brings to me. But I'd say you'd think that most people would come with all of these statistics in mind and all of these, metrics and data. And a lot of people just come because they go, this is not a representation of me anymore. And I just can no longer feel comfortable and confident leading people to my website to read this content that either, again, was cobbled together or I wrote it because I had to in a pinch as I was DIYing something in the past. And they just really want to go through that very intentional process. And I know that element was something that you had mentioned, Sarah, before we worked together, is you felt like, you had some moderate confidence in what you had been creating, but you had never really taken that opportunity to step back and really treat yourself as the client and think about like all of the brand voice pieces and the copywriting and all of that for yourself. So I think that that can be a really just strengthening thing to do in your business because it's also going to help you in the communication when you're speaking to clients because you have those phrases like you're talking about in mind, or it's going to help you in networking events. It's going to help you feel more confident leading people to your website. Like it goes so far beyond just the product itself, I guess is really what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I can definitely confirm that. For me, it's like I kind of have this toolbox where I have different phrases, different words, just like sort of a dictionary for my own brand that I can pull out and use whenever I need to. And it becomes more like the longer I use it, the easier it becomes to infuse my copy with it, whether it's for my blog or my social media captions, or even, this, it becomes so much easier to use the words that I kind of have in this database almost in this toolbox. And I can just pull out whatever I need to. And that just gives me a lot more freedom of mind because I don't have to think about how can I put that, how can I phrase that so that people can get it and so that in my brand voice. And it's just it frees up headspace because you can really focus on the points you want to get across because you already have some sort of vocabulary that you can use. So yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. I can definitely attest to that. It's amazing. But what would you say, what factors should businesses consider when deciding between investing in full website copy versus editing existing copy, which is also an option?
Yes. Yes. And it's such a good question because it's something that I kind of help clients determine when we're on that initial discovery call if they really need that full rewrite. And I would say the vast majority of people kind of fit into that category unless budget is a little bit more of a concern. And then you can kind of do more of like what we consider that copy editing refresh. But something to think about is, some of the things that immediately as indicators tell me that you fall more under the category of the full rewrite is if you are completely changing your intended audience. So I have a client coming up where she's an absolutely talented designer, but she's changing from kind of like a blue collar construction worker to more of a like high end custom home builder. Granted, they're both still somewhat in the interior design, exterior design, construction industry, but the language between those could not be more different. And even the photos, I'm like, I think the photos need to change. Maybe some of the branding needs to change. So anyway, that's just kind of one example to showcase that that might be a little bit more of a rebrand slash rehaul type of project. Whereas if there's somebody who's coming to me and saying, hey, I have the main structure of my business that I want to stay the same, and I'm speaking to the same audience, but maybe I'm adding an offer that hasn't existed before and I want to highlight it a little bit more on my website, that might be an indicator to me that says, okay, if some of this copywriting still feels like it's true to you, but we instead want to copy edit it so that maybe it's a little bit more strategically laid out on your website. And then we also want to add in this offer with a new page. Cool. Maybe that's something that we do so then we can kind of take what exists, but just improve upon it. So usually if I'm looking at a website and have the context of the client, I can kind of give some of those recommendations. But I would say those are a few indicators just to kind of look for. So again, it's like if your audience has changed completely, if your brand voice, especially if you want to fit more of a high-end market, that can be another huge indicator. I would say the same for design too, because a
Absolutely.
design that's going to resonate more with like a budget-friendly client is going to be very different than a high-end client. And then I would even say I differentiate between high-end and what I would consider luxury as well. Luxury is different. I guess I kind of put them into those three categories most of the time. I know there's nuances in between them, but those are really good things to think about. Of course, along with that, if you're changing your price points a lot, or if you're changing your entire offer suite, that usually might be something where we go, okay, we really need to just naturally rehaul most of this.
Yeah, that's so interesting because these are kind of the same factors that go into when do we rebrand completely or when
Mhm.
do we just give the brand a facelift, which is also
Exactly.
an option. But yeah, these are kind of the same points and the same concerns that I have when deciding should this be a full rebrand or should this
Mhm.
be facelift,
Yeah.
especially when you do these rewrites. How do you
Mhm.
strike the balance between maintaining consistency in the brand
Mhm.
messaging and adapting the copy to meet those evolving needs of a business?
Oh man, that is a big question.
I know.
I would say for the consistency, I mean, my natural inclination is just to think about what is it that we actually want to stay consistent, not just what already currently exists that's consistent. Because I think, you know, when you're thinking about the future of the brand, you have to take some of the existing content into account, of course, because you're building upon that. But I really want to think about, okay, how do I set this client up best for the future? And so if that means that I might need to do a little bit more copy editing, and I think even the term copy editing encompasses a lot because you can sometimes get a little dangerously close to a full rewrite. And then other copy editing, you know, people are just more so looking almost for a somewhere between a proofreader and a copy editor. So I think it's good really to make sure that you kind of define what that looks like for the client so they know the level of suggestions and edits that you're going to be giving them. But I'd say for balancing that consistency, I think a lot of it comes down to just having those really important conversations up front about kind of what strategically needs to change. And then I also really like asking clients about, you know, is there anything in their website that they're currently really proud of? Because I want to be able to know what they feel really confident in so that I'm not necessarily recreating the wheel. I don't have to as a copy editor, you know? So I think just being really intentional about the conversations and the questions that you're asking initially is going to be able to kind of create a stronger foundation to be able to have a little bit more consistency without necessarily feeling like you have to throw everything out in order to rehaul it. And then, yeah, it just never ended up being the service that they paid you for.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I'm wondering, my experience with working with you has been that I now, like I said, have this toolbox that I can pick
Sure.
and choose from, but I'm also not too worried about the brand voice overall because I have a personal brand and ultimately my voice is always going to be on brand, if you
Yeah.
will. But what would you say to a business owner or an entrepreneur who's worried about not being able to maintain the brand voice themselves? What can you tell someone who's
Yeah,
worried about
that's
that?
such a good question. And I do think doing something similar to that brand dictionary exercise can be really helpful. And so, for those of you who might be new to that idea, it's just taking some of those words and phrases that either are showing up in your content or maybe came together through a strategic conversation or call that you had with your copywriter or designer at another time. But just being able to have those things that you can really quickly plug and play into your, email templates, into your social media content. I think that, you always need to be able to have a base to pull from. So if you're worried about maintaining things, I'd say just make sure that you're able to have some of those things so you don't get that blank page syndrome. 'Cause I feel like a lot of times when people feel like, okay, I've got this really great content that exists on the website, but I'm obviously going to need to write things into the future. Either having a brand voice guide, if you decide to go through that more comprehensive process with a copywriter, can be helpful. But even if you don't have that, I think being able to look at your website with a critical eye and pull out some of those phrases, or even asking your copywriter, can you help me pull out some of those things that I can continue to use and repurpose? That can be a little bit of an easier way to feel like you're maintaining things, as well as, if you decide that you want to work with a copywriter again and ask them, where do you feel like my voice is coming out best, and how would you maybe change some of these things? So maybe it looks like a copy editing date that you have afterwards. So there's lots of different ways that I think you can go about it, and always getting feedback. But I think sometimes we're also our own worst critics. So it'll get
Absolutely.
easier over time. It really does.
Yes, yes, I can definitely confirm that. It does get easier. And I think you kind of get more used to this process of using the copy that you have as a client. But yeah,
Absolutely.
you mentioned the blank page syndrome, and I want to hear your opinion about how AI can fit
Mhm.
into that. I think that's something that's going to be concerning us more and more in the
Sure.
future. And I would love to hear, do you think that AI can replace copywriting?
So for what it is right now, no. But, in the future, who knows? I know AI for a while, for especially copywriters, was almost kind of being treated as a little bit of a boogeyman, if I may say so. It was kind of the thing that we knew was lurking in the background, but we didn't necessarily want to think about it. And like the amount of people who have heard what I do now, and they're like, "Oh, are you afraid of AI taking your job?" It's a little tongue in cheek, and I understand where people are coming from. But I think what can be helpful is like giving AI a job. So I'm not necessarily completely AI averse. I do not use it in my own process or in my own writing, at least at this point. I just don't see the real value in doing so. But for those who are having that blank page syndrome, as you've been mentioning, I think it could be helpful to maybe give it some prompts for, let's say, writing some headlines. I even recommend, when I'm writing headlines for clients, or when I have clients writing some of those on their own, if they decide to do that in the copy editing process, I always recommend writing multiple. And that's kind of one of the nice things that AI can do, is it can generate multiple of those. Even if you don't use them, you can refine them, which is kind of what I do as a copy editor. I refine the elements that my clients like, and then take away the ones that we don't like it or aren't strategic. So I think AI could possibly be like a good starting point for you, but I would not ever trust AI, at least at this point, with your website copywriting, especially when we're talking about the website strategy detail. AI does not understand website strategy. And I have seen AI actually increase in the way that it can write, audio and video transcripts. It's definitely moving forward in that direction. And then I've also seen, just to be completely vulnerable, like some of my content retainers that were focused on blog content, email content, some of my tech clients that I used to work with have decided to use that budget to create AI tools to help them do that instead, or using AI tools instead. So it's interesting. And I think what's so important is always being able to be adaptable and nimble to what people want. And it's really good to just remember the question of, like, again, if AI has a job and you as a client has a job, and then each of us as partners has a job, what does that look like? So I would say, like, that's a very overview idea of kind of where, at least in my slice of the world as a copywriter, where it seems to be that things are moving. But I'd say, like, maybe you could get away with trying to have AI help you with like little bits of headlines to get you started, but I would never trust it with like your whole entire website page.
Yes, I completely agree, especially because you also have the copyright situation in terms of law copyright,
Yeah,
because you never know where
it's
the
true.
inspiration comes from with AI. So that's definitely a tricky point
So
that,
that's so important that
yes,
I don't think everybody understands. Like AI only borrows from what you give it. And so everything that's available online, you don't necessarily know if that sentence or if that idea has come up at another point. And it would be terrible if that was a competitor or something too. So those are really good nuances to think about as well.
yes, definitely. So, yeah, thank you so much for having this great conversation. I feel like we all learned a lot from this. And before we wrap up, is there a lesson or a favorite tool that you use that you can share having your own business?
Absolutely. Oh, a favorite tool. I mean, I feel like the most boring one for me to say is just Google Docs, but truly, I do all of my work in Google Docs. I am Google Docs for life. I love collaborating with my clients in it. I also have created my own wireframing method, which is all about kind of figuring out the visual organization of your content. And I create it inside Google Docs. So it's a really easy way for me to be able to present it over. I also love Loom. Love sending Loom video recordings to my clients so that it just kind of allows me to be able to educate them on and they can listen to it on their own time. But I'd say those two tools are probably the ones that I use the most in my business and allow me to work in the way that's best for my own kind of creative process.
Yeah, fantastic. I use those tools too, and they're amazing. So, yeah,
They're the best.
definitely keeping it simple, but keeping it effective.
Yes.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much. I feel like this has been a really, really valuable conversation. And I'm so excited that I got to sit down and talk to you. Do you want to share where people can find you, how they can work with you?
Absolutely. So I am pretty easy to find. It's just KaylaHollatz.com, and you'll find me at that name on Instagram, Twitter, all of the things.
And of course, I will link all of that below the video.
That sounds
So
wonderful.
thank you so much, Kayla.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sarah.